Hello, BookTube, and welcome to possibly the beginning of a new series, but we'll see. Uh, it's this one is 10 essential science fiction reference works. I'm not calling it 10 top 10, and I'm not calling them books because there are a few things that are multiple volumes, and I think that works within it. Now, it's to deal with classic science fiction, and for lack of any other date, I'm using 1965. That's sort of a 65, 66 when Michael Moorcock took editorship of New World science fiction magazine in the UK and really pushed for the new wave. Even though there was rumblings of that in the late 50s, mid to late 50s, and then it sort of gained momentum, but definitely late 60s into the 70s. And then everything before that, despite, some people call, the modern science fiction, 1895 with with H.G. Wells's Time Machine, but I'm calling everything from ancient times to now classic science fiction, proto science fiction if you want to split it up, but everything pre 1965. So these are more or less general works on that era, and they're not specific in the sense of themes or tropes, whichever term you want to use, or specific to authors. They're more general than that. Those things can be done as another 10 essential works of X. We'll get to that later. So where do we start here? Okay, there's no order to these. Now I'm going to go for sort of general histories, more or less. Now, one of the essential ones that everybody would need to get, I think, and should get, is Brian Aldiss's, and this is the sort of second edition of it, in a sense, is The Trillion Year Spree, A History of Science Fiction. This was published in 1985, but it was an updated version of his 1973, A Billion Year Spree. This was updated with David Wingrove, and this was done in 1986. Actually, I think I said 1985, and this is Anthem. Nice little snippet about this edition. This copy is that it is from Brian Aldiss's personal library, and it's a sticker in there signed by Wendy Aldiss, the executor of the Aldiss estate. So that's kind of cool. So we have that, and he covers general science fiction. And again, it's general because it's only like 450 pages. So, and as I say, I'm not getting too bogged down with too much detail here yet. We can do that in other videos with other books. Then one of my favorites, if not my favorite, is Cory and Alexei Panshins' The World Beyond the Hill, Science Fiction and the Quest for Transcendence. This took them decades to research and then write. In 1989 it was published, and it goes right back to sort of ancient times up to about 1950s. And it encapsulates what they think is science fiction, what its impact has been, and it's a very in some ways it's a personal experience of it, but it covers the science fiction of the 20th century, or at least interwar years, really well. And there are studies of the major stories that were published, especially during the Golden Age, from 1939 to say 1950, and it's extremely well written and worth many reads. And this is where this sort of comes into play here, because these books that I'm showing are not just starters, and you move on from them. These are ones that, if you're interested in this type of science fiction, these are books that you will return to over and over again. Even though, some of the views might be considered, out of date now, or new information, they are still useful. There's the fine places to put this. However, those are older ones. Now, here's a newer one. This was published in 2016. This is our sort of updated edition of it. This is A History of Science Fiction, Adam Roberts. He's an academic. It says a professor of 19th century literature at Royal Holloway, University of London in the UK here. And this is the second edition, updated a bit. And again, it's not huge. It's just over 500 pages. So to have a history from ancient times up to now in 500 pages is going to be general, but it is very the bibliography is good, and it's new perspectives on it as well. And as I say, he does go from like SF in the ancient world, or the SF in the ancient novel, from medieval to medieval romance to 16th century utopia, 17th century SF, 18th century SF, early 19th century SF, SF 1850 to 1900, and then a whole chapter on Vernon Wells, early 20th century, so the high modernist SF, and then the pulps, and then the golden age, 1940 to 1960, and the impact of the new wave, the 1970s, and he goes into screen media, Hollywood cinema and TV, 60 to 2000, and then prose SF of the 1980s and 90s, late 20th century SF, and then 20th century. He brings it right up to sort of date. So even though my interest, I have not read this, I haven't read the later parts yet, actually, to be honest. I've read sections of the earlier ones. But yeah, so this is a newer, updated one. So yeah, it's not all old stuff. There's some new stuff in here as well. Let's see here. Along with that, another new one, sorry, I gotta reach down, is Science Fiction Criticism, an Anthology of Essentials Writing. This is Bloomsbury Academic. It's another fairly thick, it's 500 some pages, almost 600. And it was published in 2017. And it's exactly what it says. It's essays. They're historical essays for science fiction. And it starts out with like Hugo Gernsback editorial for his April 1926 amazing stories called A New Sort of Magazine. And then you've got even an essay or preface by H.G. Wells. You got Robert Heinlein, Judith Merrill, Bruce Sterling, Veronica Hollinger, Roger Luckhurst, John Ryder, J.G. Ballard, Samuel R. Delaney, Darko Sullivan, Mark Argonaut, Damien Broderick, Susan Sontag, Joanna Russ, Frederick Jameson, Carl Friedman, Phil K. Dick, and even Mary Shelley's introduction to Frankenstein, Catherine Hayes, Werner Vinge. It goes on with some academics and not so academic and authors. Now, there's an introduction to each sort of section, setting it up, and then there are, for each sort of essay, there are, for the most part, it's very well annotated, and then at the end of the section, there are further reading. There's great bibliographical information. So this is a really, really good book. The hardcover of this one and the previous one are quite expensive, so it's not. I couldn't afford the hardcovers. So let me just put these aside here. And then we'll sort of change gears a little bit to British science fiction. So this is a little more narrow, but it's still general because it's covering 1895 to 1965. And this is Mike Ashley's Yesterday's Tomorrow's, the story of British science fiction in 100 books. And this is British Library. This was published in 1920. It's sort of a companion guide to their series of classic science fiction, which is mostly short stories. It's edited by Mike Ashley, and they're very representative. And here too, he goes through and talks about it's thematic rather than chronological. But the sort of most representative science fiction of these periods of each year. And he usually has like two, 3 pages on each book. And there's an color insert section with covers, first editions. It's a very nice production. It's got French flaps, and as I say, it's not so much the best books, but the most representative. And I think this is something that I've ever since I got it, I've continually dipped into it, read little sections. It's extremely good, and you'll be surprised to find out that there's some authors that you never knew wrote science fiction. So that's very good. Now, staying with Mike Ashley, or Michael Ashley, is he's done a series of that's called The Story of Science Fiction Magazines. And there's 5 out now. There's a new one that brings it right up to 2020. I don't have that one yet. I'll go more into detail of the later volumes when I do, because I do want a video on sort of the history of the science fiction magazine, or reference works for that. And this will be pride of place in that. And the first 2, though, cover my period. And this is from the beginning to 1950. Now, it's not that big, but it covers everything. And it's packed with information, like very dense information. But again, it's like a chapter on each magazine. So it's an overview. So it's not super detailed. And that's where I will do a separate video on books that are more detailed for those specific magazines. But that's the 1950, and it's wonderful. In the back, it's got directory appendices, grids of the magazines, like every month they were published, the editors, how long they were there, the cover artists, selected bibliography. It's wonderful. And then it goes on to 1950 to 1970. With transformations, same deal, and it's international as well. So he's got a section in the back talking about international non-English language magazines, which is really nice. Now, and then the other 2 volumes I have are 1971 to 1980, and then 1981 to 1990, and he's currently, well, it's out now. It's called The Rise of the Cyberzines, I think it's called. And it's 1991 to 2020. However, this is sort of a second iteration of his history of science fiction books. I've got 3. I've got all 4, but I don't know where the volume 2 is. Now, these are worth having because, as I say, they are like other editions, and I'm going to slide a few of those in occasionally. This is the History of Science Fiction magazine, edited by Michael Ashley, and it says edited because, and this is 1926 to 1935. Great cover with the wraparound on the back, and he's got an essay about the magazines. It's shorter, but then he's got selections of the sort of most representative and what he thinks are the better stories from those magazines. So it's an anthology as well as a history, and he goes through. There was 4 volumes that he did, and I don't have volume 2. I do have volume 2, but I can't find it. And we'll go more detail in these when I do the magazine one. And then we got part 3 is 1946 to 1955, same deal. And then the last one they did was 1956 to 1965. And they are more anthologies, but they sort of can be read in tandem with this. His view sometimes changes of what's better or not better because he references not everything that's in here. There are issues. There's issues with all these, but and I'll just sort of give a caveat at the end regarding the issues. Okay, another one that's to do with magazines, a more general than this one, but it's Mike Ashley and Marshall B. Tim. It's science fiction, fantasy, and weird fiction magazines. A great big encyclopedia. This is a print-on-demand, cased. It's just awful editions. I'd love to get an original one. This was published in 1985, and it's part of a series by Greenwood Press called Historical Guides to the World's Periodicals and Newspapers, and there's many interesting titles. Now, what this does is, for all fantasy, weird fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and weird fiction magazines, it has entries of the name. Let's say here, Ghosts and Goblins. I've never heard of that one. And it goes through a little bit of a history, and then information, bibliography, and then the publication history, a little bit at the end. So it gives you a really good sort of overview of that magazine. Just a brief sort of potted history of that magazine. Then you can go looking for more detail, and that's where I will talk about the other detail in another video. Books with other details. Now, sticking with sort of an encyclopedia type book, we've got the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, the second edition by John Kloot and Peter Nichols, that was put out in 1993. Yes. It's a big honkin' bugger. And it is double columned, and it has it's just anything. Authors, tropes, themes, publishers, the magazines, again, brief description of magazines. A little less information in here than the other, definitely the other ones, but again, a good jumping off point. And they even have a little bibliography at times from of the author, say. And this is the second edition, as I say. It is currently the third edition, or fourth edition possibly, is online. However, I think having a book of this, if you're very interested in this subject, is better, because you can peruse this. If you specifically want to look up Clifford D. Simak, you can. But if you just want to flip through and you don't know who Clifford D. Simak is, and you see a 2-page entry for that, you might sit and read and go, "Oh, I want to try him." And you would not have done that with the online. But as I say, this is the second edition. Now, earlier editions, like the magazines one, the first edition is worth having as well. That was done in 1979 by just Peter Nichols, and it's illustrated. This is the hardcover of that, and it's 3 columns, but it's illustrated, as I say. And it's black and white illustrations, but it's worthwhile. The entries are much slower. Much smaller. I do need to plug this in because I'm running out of power, so I need to plug it in. Hopefully that won't affect the recording. No, I think that's fine. So yeah, and then there is a sort of tangent to this, an offshoot of it that John Kloot did, specifically illustrated Encyclopedia of Science Fiction by Dorian Kinserly. It was published in 1995, and it's more of a coffee table book. But you see there, you got James Blish, Cordwainer Smith. It's got a photograph. It's got their facsimile of their signature. It's got their bibliography down at the bottom, and the other side is Andre Norton. Yeah, and then you got 1970 74, the next generation, like a little timeline. It's a very useful book as well. And that's and then we'll go to what sort of is, to me, has always been a very essential reference work for me. Sorry, I'm just getting the other editions up here of this. There we go. It's called Anatomy of Wonder. This is the 5th, and it's the final edition. It's a critical guide to science fiction. It's basically an annotated bibliography, but a selective bibliography. And it's got a huge section on the primary literature, like books that, for instance, if a library wants to have a representative collection of science fiction, they could use this as a representative of that. And it's got just trying to see here, this first section, it'll have primary literature. It has like about 2,000, I think, titles in here, close to 2,000 titles. And then, like, for each section, they got the critical history, and they've got essays for different time periods, because it's also in time periods as well. If you want just to, collect science fiction from 64 to 83, 1940 to 63, or anything like that. Then you've got the secondary literature, like general works, like history that I'm going through here. There's a lot more that's listed in here, and they go through the good points and bad points. Sometimes, well, I'll get to that in a moment, because it's a general catch-all for these type of things. But it's edited by Neil Barron. There's other editors and writers of the descriptions of each book. There's a whole list of them in there. But you see, this is the 5th one. I do like the earlier editions of them. This is the first edition. This is an ex-library, so it's in rough shape. This was published in 1976, first of all. And it's the same idea, but much, much smaller. And with each edition, they added stuff and took some out. So it's always nice to see what they took out, and especially a lot of the earlier material, earlier science fiction, they took out subsequently from editions. Now we get 2nd edition, again, same thing, expanded and taken away, 1981. Now we got the 3rd edition. This is the one that I bought, and this is the one I mostly used. And this was 1989. And I don't have the 4th edition, but it's along the same lines as that. Yeah, so then now take out sort of a big gun here. I think this is the 10th one, I think. Sort of lost count. This is a honkin' book by Everett F. Blyer. It's science fiction in the early years. It was published in 1990 by Kent State University Press, and it's a full description of more than 3,000 science fiction stories from earliest times to appearance in the genre magazines in 1930, with author, title, and motif indexes. It's with the assistance of Richard J. Blyer, which I always sort of keep saying it's his brother, but I think it's his son. And it's by columned, and it's again just a annotated bibliography with lots and lots of information. If you're interested in early science fiction, this is the place to go. If you just sort of want to peruse things, it's an excellent publication. I don't know if it's still in print or it's one of these reprint ones. So that's the 10. So let's do a couple sort of honorable mentions. But this one honorable mention is a must. So we'll either call it 10B or something like that. And I'll call it 10B because it's the same. If that's the 10th one, this is 10B. Okay, there's the cover of the new Mike Ashley's science fiction, the history of science fiction magazines, and that's the cover of the volume 2 of the original science fiction magazines. Now the 10B is sort of in combination with, it's by the same editors, Richard Blyer and I think Everett Blyer started it. It's science fiction writers, the 19th and 20th century, and that's the cover of that, and that's the second edition. And see, the first edition was edited by his father, Everett F. Blyer, and it's the critical studies of the major authors from the early 19th century to the present day. This is an essential. I do need to get that. I've never had this. I do need to get it, and other ones that he has done, but we'll talk about those at a later time. So that is sort of my 10/11. But if I had this one, then I probably would have taken out the I don't know where it's set now. The 100 British science fictions, and I would have added that one. So let's go for a few more sort of honorable mentions. And this is British science fiction, a chronology, 1478 to 1990 by Nicholas Ruddick. This is just a checklist. There's not much information other than bibliographical information, and it's chronological. So it's actually quite nice because it is chronological. You can look at it that way. But there's no information specifically about the contents. But you can see authors, and then you can look them up other places. So this is quite good also. Now, going back to some older things about science fiction, like critical appraisals. Now, this has been considered possibly the first thesis, university thesis. And it's Modern Science Fiction, a Critical Analysis, the seminal 1951 thesis with a new introduction commentary by James Gunn. And it's forward by Gary K. Wolfe, who's a sort of a current historian of science fiction. And this is McFarlane. This has been published, the complete, because it was an edited version was published originally in I wonder if it says here, in a magazine in the 1950s, I believe. This is 2018. I don't see the original. Yeah, and I sometimes have said that this is a PhD thesis. It's an MA thesis, but James Gunn is at the time he's passed away now. He's died, and that he is emeritus professor of English at the University of Kansas, and the author of editor of 45 books and 100 plus short stories. A fabulous anthology of science fiction called The Road to Science Fiction. We'll get to that in our anthology episode. And yeah, so this is a very good one. And another one is an older one, but it was based on I think a PhD thesis by, I've shown this before, J.O. Bailey. It's called Pilgrims Through Space and Time: A History and Analysis of Science Fiction. And this was published it's by Argus Books, published in 1947, and it's basically what does he call it here? Because it's trends and patterns in utopian science fiction but it's science fiction, or romance science fiction. So it's earlier, but it's still it's historically important, even though a lot of the ideas are superseded. But those are that's I think that would be a good start. So the 10 again are Mike Ashley's. Not in any order here. I'll put them down at the bottom. Mike Ashley's Story of Science Fiction Magazines. Adam Roberts' History of Science Fiction. That's Bloomsbury. Rob Latham's Science Fiction Criticism, a collection of essays. Trillionaire Spree by Brian Aldiss and David Wingrove. Wingrove. The World Beyond the Hill, Quest for Science Fiction and Quest for Transcendence by Alexei and Cory Panshin. Science Fiction in the Early Years, Everett F. Blyer. Anatomy of Wonder, edited by Neil Barron. Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Weird Fiction Magazines, edited by Marshall B. Tim and Mike Ashley. I can't find the there it is. The Yesterday's Tomorrows by Mike Ashley. 100 books. The story of classic British science fiction in 100 books. And the Richard Blyer and Everett F. Blyer's critical studies of major authors from the early 19th century to the present day. I'll list them all down below. But yeah, so that's it. And if it's something that you would like to see again, or like, you know, other iterations of this, like maybe more specific of early science fiction, or specifically American Golden Age, 1930s, 1940s, 1920s. I'm going to do a magazine one, a general magazine one, with more specific titles on specific magazines. So a 10 essential science fiction magazine resource works type thing, and as well as a anthology, essential anthology ones, all pre 1965 material, more or less. That's not going to be held across the board, because there'll be some books that have later material in. And I wanted to say too is that even though some of these are old, regardless if they're new ones, I find that the historians, writers of this material, any material, have their hobby horses, have their pet peeves, and it does show. However, hopefully there's not too many, and then you can compare those, because and you just have to keep it an open eye. You've got to know what their definition of X, what their definition of science fiction is, and then that will be a basis or a foundation. Then you can go and judge what they're saying. So that's kind of thing. If you do want anything more like this on any topics, do sound out in the comments. There's topics that I can't do because I have no knowledge of it. I have no books. But there's other things like film I could do, classic film. I've got the books. I won't be able to access them, but I can at least show you pictures and talk about them. So do sound out in the comments. Let me know if you like this and you'd like to see more. Take care, BookTube.